I still remember the day when Mr. Is, our richest man in the village, slammed his office door on his own family's plea for help. I was standing outside his large compound when I saw him wave dismissively at his younger brother, Chinedu, who was begging for a little cash to pay for his sick mother's medicine. The look on Mr. Isa's face was cold and unyielding, and it sent a chill down my spine. It was unsettling to see a man so rich and powerful ignore the pain of his own kin. I couldn't help but wonder how someone with so much wealth could be so selfish, so unfeeling, even in the face of family suffering. Mr. Is had built his wealth from nothing, starting as a small trader and growing into a man who owned several shops, a fleet of trucks, and even a beautiful, sprawling compound on the edge of our village. I had watched him work tirelessly, day and night, to earn every cent of his fortune. Yet, as his wealth grew, so did his heart harden. In the early days, he was known for his generous spirit, but as time passed, he became more focused on his money than on his people. I saw him count his earnings late into the night and lock them away in a big safe, as if his fortune was the only thing that mattered in life. His eyes sparkled when he talked about his money but never softened when family members asked for a little help. Our village had always been a close-knit place where families looked out for each other. I had grown up hearing the old stories of unity and love, where every relative shared the burdens and joys of life. Mr. Isa's family, however, was different now. His older brother, Chinedu, who had once been a pillar of support, now struggled on his own after Mr. Is had turned his back on him. I remember Chinedu coming to the market one morning, his clothes worn and eyes tired, asking a few people if anyone had heard from his rich brother. The disappointment in his voice was hard to miss. It was clear that, in Mr. Isa's eyes, family ties had become as worthless as the old clothes he discarded. One rainy afternoon, as the clouds grumbled above and the earth soaked up every drop, Chinedu and his small family knocked on Mr. Isa's heavy wooden door. Their faces were full of hope, yet trembling with fear, as they pleaded for some money to fix their leaky roof and buy food. I remember standing by the roadside, trying to hide my tears as I listened to their desperate words. But inside that grand house, Mr. Is simply shrugged and said, "I have my own problems. You should have thought of saving some money for yourselves." His voice was as cold as the rain, and his eyes showed no hint of compassion. The rejection was so sharp and unfair that even the sound of the rain seemed to weep for the suffering family. I later heard that at a family reunion held in the village square, Mr. Is once made a joke about his brother's constant need for money. In front of a small crowd, he laughed and said, "If I had to help everyone who asked for a coin, I would be as poor as you." His words echoed in the air, making many people frown in disbelief. I couldn't help but laugh too, not because it was funny, but because the situation was so absurd that it made you see the dark humor in life. The rich man's words were cruel, yet they brought a bitter smile to those who had long seen his selfish ways. The laughter was awkward, filled with shock and sadness, and it underscored the gap between wealth and human warmth. During one of my visits to the local market, I saw Mr. Is strutting around in his new, tailored suit, clearly enjoying the admiration of the townsfolk. He was always the center of attention, his wealth shining like the morning sun. But when his cousin, who was known to be struggling, called him over to share some good news about the new harvest, Mr. Is brushed him off with a wave of his hand. "I'm busy counting my money," he said with a haughty tone. The poor cousin was left standing there, feeling small and ignored. That scene, full of irony and pain, stayed with me for many days, as it highlighted the stark contrast between the man's riches and his lack of basic human kindness. I remember one particular evening when Mr. Isa's younger brother, Chinedu, came to his mansion after a long day of work on his small farm. Chinedu's clothes were dusty and his face was lined with worry. He had barely enough to feed his family, yet he mustered up the courage to ask for a small loan to buy seeds for the next planting season. Mr. Is, busy polishing his expensive car in the driveway, barely looked at him. With a laugh, he told Chinedu to go get it yourself, and said that money was meant for those who earned it, not for those who begged. I was standing a little distance away, shocked and saddened by his lack of empathy, and I wondered if money had indeed become his only true friend. One sunny morning, I saw Mr. Is hosting a lavish breakfast at his home, inviting business partners and wealthy friends. The table was laden with jollof rice, fried plantains, and a variety of exotic fruits. The aroma filled the air with a promise of joy and celebration. Meanwhile, I passed by a modest hut not far from his estate, where his family huddled around a small fire, trying to make a simple meal from whatever they could gather. The stark difference between the two scenes was like night and day. I felt a pang in my heart seeing the contrast, a man with more than enough food for many families, yet his own kin starved quietly, unseen and unheard. I later spoke with one of the elder neighbors at the communal well about Mr. Isa's behavior. With a heavy sigh, the old man recalled the days when family meant sharing and caring, but now greed had replaced that warmth. Back in my time, he said slowly, we helped our kin without a second thought. But this man, he is blinded by his wealth. He sees only his money, and his heart is as empty as a dried-out calabash. His words, simple and honest, resonated with everyone listening. The neighbor's story painted a clear picture of how things had changed. It was not long before even the villagers began to notice that Mr. Isa's selfish ways were taking a toll on the community spirit. As days turned into weeks, whispers of Mr. Isa's selfish behavior spread throughout our village. I heard people at the market discussing how his greed was not just about money but about a lack of compassion. At the local church, during quiet moments of prayer, many mentioned in hushed tones that he was a man who had lost his way. Some even joked that his fortune was measured in cold, hard coins and not in the warmth of a shared meal. I could see in the eyes of those who had suffered his neglect a mix of anger and sadness. They knew that if even the richest man in our community could not be kind to his own family, then what hope did the rest of us have? One bright afternoon, I attended a community meeting in the open-air village hall, where Mr. Is was invited to speak about his recent business successes. With a confident smile, he boasted about his latest expansion and the profits he had made. However, his tone shifted abruptly when a young man, clearly related to him, rose from the back of the room to ask for a small sum of money to fix his broken roof. The room fell silent as Mr. Is sneered and said, "Money does not grow on trees, my friend. I have worked hard for my wealth, and I will not waste it on those who do not work as hard." The response was met with murmurs of discontent and a few stifled chuckles. It was a public display of his cold nature that left many shaking their heads in disbelief. I once saw a particularly dramatic scene at Mr. Isa's compound during a family crisis. Late one night, in the dead of a hot, stifling evening, his sister-in-law arrived at his gate, her eyes red from crying and her hands trembling as she held a worn-out bag. She pleaded for money to pay for a long-overdue school fee for her children, explaining that the local school was closing soon and that the children needed proper education. Mr. Is listened for only a moment before dismissing her with a casual, "I have no extra money for such trivial matters." The harshness in his tone was evident, and the poor woman left with a broken heart, knowing that no matter how much she cried, her pleas would fall on deaf ears. In another incident that still haunts me, I recall a rainy day when Mr. Isa's family gathered at a humble home, trying to salvage what little they had. The downpour had washed away most of their hopes as they begged for some assistance to rebuild their lives. Inside that small house, every person wore an expression of quiet despair as they recounted their troubles. I sat on a nearby bench, my heart heavy as I listened to their story of neglect. Even though nature itself was weeping, Mr. Isa's heart remained dry and unyielding. His refusal to help was not only a personal failure but a stain on the shared values that our community once held dear. One humorous yet painful moment unfolded during a local festival when Mr. Is was seen in his finest attire, boasting about his wealth to anyone who would listen. As music filled the air and children ran around playing, I noticed his brother, Chinedu, standing at a stall with a faded sign that read, "For sale, old things." With a mix of pride and sadness, Chinedu had taken to selling second-hand items to earn a few coins. Mr. Is walked past him with a sneer, remarking loudly, "Is that all you can do with your time?" I invest in real businesses, not in peddling old junk." The crowd burst into nervous laughter, and even though the comment was meant as a joke, it cut deep. I could see tears in Chinidu's eyes, and I knew that the humor of the moment was as bitter as it was obvious. On another day, I accompanied a friend to Mr. Isa's estate to attend a charity event he was hosting for the rich and influential. The event was meant to showcase his generosity, but the irony was not lost on anyone who knew the truth. The hall was decorated with expensive cloths and sparkling lights, and gourmet food was served to the elite. Yet, when a local community leader politely asked if any money could be set aside to help the struggling families in our area, Mr. Is quickly waved his hand dismissively and said, "Charity is for those who have extra time, not for me. I earn my money the hard way, and I do not spare a dime for those who do not work as hard." His words, uttered with a smug grin, elicited a mixture of laughter and sighs from the guests, highlighting the absurdity of his self-proclaimed generosity. I have often wondered how a man so wealthy could be so blind to the need of those closest to him. One evening, while sitting under the stars near a quiet riverbank, I listened to the soft murmur of villagers discussing Mr. Isa's many misdeeds. They spoke in low voices about how he had turned his back on his family, choosing instead to fill his coffers with money. Even the children in the community knew the story by heart, and they would whisper to one another that Mr. Isa's fortune was like a mountain, high and mighty, yet incapable of moving an inch when it came to caring for others. I could not help but feel that his wealth was a lonely burden that left him isolated from the very people he once called kin. One sunny morning, as I walked through the village, I saw Mr. Is driving his shiny new truck along the main road. The truck was adorned with gold-plated accents and bold letters that boasted his name. As he passed, I noticed his brother, Chinidu, standing at the roadside with a small bag in his hand, waiting for a ride to the market. Mr. Isa's face remained unmoved by the sight of his struggling sibling. Instead, he honked his horn and drove past without a backward glance. That moment was both comical and tragic, a rich man showing off his luxury while leaving his family to fend for themselves, as if the road to wealth was a one-way street that he refused to share. Later that week, a heated argument broke out in the village hall during a community meeting. Several relatives had gathered to discuss their common challenges, and the topic of Mr. Isa's selfish ways became the center of attention. With voices raised and hands gesturing, the family members expressed their hurt and disappointment. I sat in the back, my heart heavy as I listened to Chinidu recount his many pleas for help that had gone unanswered. One elderly aunt, with tears in her eyes, accused Mr. Is of abandoning the very values that had once made their family strong. Her words were filled with both anger and sorrow, and even though some tried to calm her down, the message was clear: selfishness had left deep scars in a family that once knew love and unity. In the days that followed the community meeting, I noticed a shift in the atmosphere among Mr. Isa's relatives. They began to rely more on one another for support, setting aside old grievances to help each other survive the tough times. I saw neighbors sharing food and lending a hand to those in need, a stark contrast to the cold indifference shown by Mr. Is. One evening, as I walked past a small, busy kitchen where Chinidu and his family were preparing a modest meal together, I realized that sometimes, the bonds of family could heal even the deepest wounds left by selfishness. The scene was both heartwarming and a little funny, as relatives joked about how they were their own charity, and it made me wonder if Mr. Is would ever learn that true wealth was measured not in coins, but in love. Over time, the villagers began to hold small gatherings where they openly discussed the lessons they had learned from Mr. Isa's behavior. In these humble meetings, held under large baobab trees or in simple community halls, people shared stories of how selfishness could destroy relationships. One elder told a tale of a man who had lost everything because he refused to help others, and the laughter that followed was filled with a mix of amusement and regret. I listened to these stories with a heavy heart, knowing that while Mr. Isa's behavior was extreme, it served as a reminder that wealth without compassion was a lonely existence. The humor in these gatherings was subtle, as everyone knew that even a rich man could be the subject of a good, if bitter, joke. One memorable day, a crisis hit the village when a sudden storm damaged several homes, including that of Chinedu and his family. In the midst of the chaos, the community rallied together, pooling resources to help those in need. I was there, helping to pass buckets of water and share meager supplies with neighbors. When word reached Mr. Is about the disaster, I watched in disbelief as he simply shrugged and said, "It's not my problem. They should have built stronger houses." His careless remark echoed in the cold wind, and even as others worked tirelessly to rebuild, his mansion remained untouched by the spirit of cooperation. That day, his selfishness became a symbol of the gulf between wealth and humanity, and the incident was remembered with both sadness and a touch of dark humor. In a small roadside cafe one afternoon, I overheard a conversation between two of Mr. Isa's distant relatives. They spoke quietly but passionately about how his refusal to help had hurt the entire family. One said, "He has all this money, yet he treats us like strangers. What kind of man values coins over kin?" The other, shaking her head, replied, "I heard he even laughed when his brother begged for a little help. It is like he is allergic to family love." Their words, though filled with bitterness, carried an undercurrent of humor that made it hard not to smile at the absurdity of the situation. In that moment, I realized that sometimes, the harshest truths could be dressed in simple, everyday language that struck right at the heart of a broken family. A few weeks later, Mr. Is had a chance meeting with an old friend at a busy market store. The friend, who had once shared many laughs with him in their youth, asked, "Why do you never help your family when they call out to you?" Mr. Is, with a dismissive wave and a smirk, replied, "I have earned my money, I do not need to be dragged down by others' misfortunes." The friend shook his head in disbelief, muttering something about how true wealth meant sharing, not hoarding. The encounter was both amusing and sad to witness, as even those who had once admired him now saw the cracks in his shining facade. It was a moment that left a mark on me, emphasizing that a man's true character is revealed when he chooses between wealth and family. Despite the many disappointments, Chinedu continued to try and mend the broken ties of their once close family. I watched as he, with quiet determination, reached out to Mr. Is on more than one occasion, offering help and understanding even when met with cold responses. On one occasion, Chinedu visited the mansion with a basket of fresh produce from his farm, hoping to remind his brother of the simple joys they once shared. Mr. Is barely acknowledged him, saying only, "I don't need these things, I have everything I want." The rejection stung, yet Chinedu's gentle persistence became a small beacon of hope for the rest of us. It was a reminder that sometimes, even in the face of harsh words, the love of a family member could speak louder than wealth. One day, in a twist that seemed almost comical, Mr. Is was hosting a grand dinner party for his business partners. As he paced around, ensuring every detail was perfect, he accidentally tripped over a stray stone in his lavish garden. In a scene that could have been straight out of a folk tale, he fell headfirst into a large mud puddle, much to the amusement of his guests. Even his closest aides couldn't help but laugh, though they quickly helped him up. Yet, when I later learned that his brother had called him that very morning for help with a leaking roof, it struck me as deeply ironic that a man so careful with his appearance could be so careless with his heart. The incident, though funny, was a sharp reminder of the gap between wealth and true human kindness. As time went by, a small yet noticeable change began to take root among Mr. Isa's family. Left to fend for themselves, they started relying on one another, growing closer and stronger with every challenge they faced. I saw them repairing their homes, sharing meals, and even laughing together at the absurdity of their situation. The community rallied around them, offering support and kind words. It was as if the very act of being neglected by one person forced them to rediscover the value of love and unity. Their resilience was both heartwarming and, in a bittersweet way, a silent joke at Mr. Isa's expense. They learned that sometimes, self-reliance and family bonds were worth more than all the money in the world. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low over the village, casting long shadows over the dusty roads, I noticed that Mr. Is seemed to be facing troubles of his own. Business was slow, and even his lavish parties were not drawing the same crowds as before. I heard whispers among the villagers that perhaps his selfish ways had finally caught up with him. While he still had plenty of money, it seemed that the wealth could not shield him from the loneliness that came with a hardened heart. I saw him sitting alone in his grand office, staring out of the window at a world that had moved on without him, and I couldn't help but feel that karma was slowly making its presence known in a funny, yet undeniable, way. The turning point came during a local festival, where the entire village gathered to celebrate a bountiful harvest. In the midst of the festivities, Mr. Is was expected to make a grand speech about unity and prosperity. Instead, his speech was filled with empty boasts about his wealth and dismissive remarks about those who needed help. As he droned on, his family watched from the back, their expressions a mix of sadness and quiet defiance. When he finally finished, a hush fell over the crowd, and someone in the audience shouted, "Wealth without love is nothing but dust in the wind." Laughter broke out among the villagers, not cruelly, but as a shared, cathartic release. That moment marked a clear shift in the community's attitude towards him. In the weeks that followed, Mr. Is found himself increasingly isolated. His business partners, who once admired him, began to question his values, and even his closest acquaintances started avoiding him. I watched as the rich man, who had once walked with a proud strut, now shuffled along the market streets with his head held low, as if the weight of his own greed had become too heavy to bear. The irony was not lost on anyone. His refusal to help his own family had turned him into a pariah, a subject of whispered jokes and cautionary tales. The community's laughter, once a sign of unity, now echoed as a reminder that selfishness, no matter how cloaked in wealth, eventually leads to isolation. Looking back on all these events, I have learned that true wealth is not measured in money or fancy things, but in the love and care we show for one another. Mr. Isa's story serves as a funny yet harsh reminder that when you choose to hoard riches at the expense of family and community, you may gain coins but lose your heart. Even though the tale is filled with moments of humor and irony, it is also a real lesson in life. The village now speaks of him as a man who had it all but chose to live alone. His story lives on as a folk tale, passed from one generation to the next, reminding us all that a heart that gives is far richer than a heart that hoards.